I guess it was a couple of weeks ago, maybe last week, we began with the quiz, so I'm going to kind of do the same thing this morning and to ask you, these symbols that you see behind me, what do they all represent? Peace, right? They're symbols that we all immediately recognize that have something to do with peace. And what's really interesting about every one of those symbols is actually they were all created, or they all grew out of a time when there wasn't much peace. The first sign, the one that you see there on the left, peace sign that we're all familiar with, I think a lot of you have probably heard over the years, well, that has something to do with the occult or with Satan, which I always thought myself up till I did some research on this week. And I found that actually this grew out of a time in the 1950s, late 1950s in Britain. And there was this guy named Gerald Holton, and he developed this symbol out of what was known as the nuclear disarmament period, or the movement that they had. And actually what that symbol was supposed to be was a symbol that represented the semaphore signals for the letters N and D. So the letter N that looks like this in semaphore, and the letter D that looks like this. And so what that was, it was a symbol that represented the N and the D, which were the initials for the nuclear disarmament movement. And what happened is that over a period of time, that sign came over to the United States. And most of you who were alive at the time remember that became a symbol of the anti-war movement, especially during the Vietnam War. And so that's how that peace symbol came to be used. The one you see in the middle, the two fingers with the V, originally it was a sign that meant victory. It came out of World War II. It's one that Winston Churchill and the people would use to signify that there was victory during the war. But once again, that same symbol ends up coming over to the United States years later, and it gets used again in the anti-war movement back in the 1960s. The final one you recognize with the dove and the olive branch, I think you all know where that one comes, right? It comes from the time of the flood. And when the ark finally rests on solid ground, Noah sends out this dove, and it comes back with an olive branch in its mouth. And so that became a time of peace that really grew out of the chaos of the flood and everything that went along with that. And over time, it's become a symbol of peace as well. So all those symbols of peace, they grew out of a time when really there wasn't any peace. And we recognize them as those symbols, but this morning we're going to talk about someone else who actually did bring peace. Not just a symbol of peace, but who brought real peace to this world. Jesus, when he came to this world about over 2,000 years ago, he also came into this world at a time when there really wasn't any peace. I mean, you think about it, it was a time of chaos. It was a time when people really weren't at peace with each other or with God. This morning we're going to continue our look at Advent, and we're going to look at the gift of peace. But over the last 3 weeks now, it's hard to believe we're already in week 4. We've been looking at this season of Advent. We've talked about the idea that Advent is a word that means coming or arrival. And this whole time of Advent, I hope you've been using it in your families to think back to what it would have been like, where the people were waiting for the Messiah to come to the earth, waiting in expectation, and also a time where now we're waiting for Jesus to come back once again. And so we've been looking at this time of Advent. And we've been looking at gifts. And if you remember, we began the first week, we began with the gift of hope. And we found that with that hope, that when Jesus came into the world, that he gave us hope, and that hope allowed us to deal with our sins of the past. It allowed us to live a godly life right now here in the present, and it gave us hope that one day in the future all our fears would be taken care of when Jesus Christ comes again. The second week, we lit the second candle, which was the gift of love. And we talked about the fact that when Jesus came to this earth, he brought God's love down to us. Not just a love that was some kind of an emotion, but a love that was an action. An action that God took even when we didn't deserve it. And an action that he took even though he knew that most people were going to reject it. And we saw how that love that God has for us, how he brought it into the world at that time. Last week we lit the third candle, which was the candle of joy. And if you remember, we talked about the fact that true joy is more than just an emotion. It's more than just happiness. It's having the joy of Jesus living in us as we abide or we stay connected to Him. Finally, this morning, we come to the last candle. And this morning, we're going to look at the gift of peace that Jesus brought into that world, into our world that very first Christmas. You'll remember that as the angels came, we saw that this morning in some of the songs that we sang, that they brought a message of peace to the world. Here's what it says in Luke chapter 3. And suddenly there was with the angels a multitude of the heavenly host, praising God and saying, Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace among those with whom He is pleased. See, like the conflict and the turmoil that produced those peace symbols that we looked at before, this was a time of chaos that Jesus came into the world. I mean, think about it, especially for the Jews. The Jews were living there in Judea, and they were under the rule of the Romans, and the Romans weren't too friendly to the Jews. And they had this king over them, this guy named Herod, that was especially mean to the Jews. We know about that. We see it in the Christmas accounts, especially with the wise men and what Herod wanted to do to all the babies there. But not only was it a time of kind of political turmoil, it was also a time when the Jews really didn't have peace with God either. I mean, think about it. The last time they had heard directly from God was about 400 years earlier from the prophet Malachi. And so the Jews had this separation from God, and they were waiting to hear a word from God, and here God brings not just a word, but He brings the word into the world to speak to them through Jesus Christ. It's really interesting. If you read that passage, what you see there's already a hint there that not everyone is going to get that peace, right? It says only ones that are going to get that peace are those with whom God is pleased. And we're going to talk a little bit more this morning about who those people are and how we can make sure that we fit into that group and that we have the gift of peace. Once again, this morning, in order for us to understand what that kind of peace is like and how we can have it, how we can enjoy it in our life, we're going to go to a passage that's not usually associated with Christmas. We're going to look at Colossians chapter 1. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and take them out. Turn to Colossians chapter 1. We're going to look at verses 15 through 23 this morning. Colossians chapter 1. Great passage here about Jesus. It's one of my favorite passages to really describe who Jesus is and all the great things He's done for us. Here's what Paul writes. He, and he's speaking of Jesus, if you go back and look at the context, He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by Him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through Him and for Him. And He is before all things, and in Him all things hold together. And He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything He might be preeminent. For in Him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through Him to reconcile to Himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace, and there's the idea of peace there, by the blood of His cross. And you, who were once alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, He is now reconciled in His body of flesh by His death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before Him, if indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel you've heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and which I, Paul, became a minister. As I read this passage over the last couple weeks and studied it, the one thing that came to mind is this slogan that probably you're familiar with. You may have seen it on bumper stickers or T-shirts, and it's this one: no Jesus, no peace. No Jesus, with a K-N-O-W, no peace. And I think that's what this passage is really telling us. If we don't have Jesus in our lives, it's just not possible to have the kind of peace that Paul writes about here. But if we really know Jesus, if we abide in Him, like we talked about last week, if we're connected with Him, then guess what? We can have the kind of peace that Paul is writing about here. I mean, think about it. Jesus didn't just come to bring peace. Jesus is peace. That's why in the Scriptures, Isaiah said he would be called the Prince of Peace. And so this morning, here's what I want to look at. First of all, why do I need to know Jesus if I want to know peace? I mean, you know, that's a cute little bumper sticker, but why is it true? And I think this passage gives us the answer to that. And the first thing that we need to understand is, without Jesus, I'm at war with God. That's what verse 21 talks about. It says here, if we don't have Jesus, if we don't know Jesus, then we're at war with God. That's the condition of every single person who has ever been born in this world. When we come into this world, we have that sin nature that we talked about back in Romans, and because of that, the Bible tells us that we're hostile to God. We're at war with Him. I mean, think about it. We saw the same exact thing just a few weeks ago, didn't we, in Romans chapter 8? Because there, what do we see? It says that those who are without the Spirit are hostile to God. And we talked about it at that time. That doesn't mean that we shake a fist in God's face, but what it means is that we'd rather live life on our own terms than to submit to God. And because of that, therefore, that we're hostile to God and we can't submit to God's law. It also says here that when we do that, as Paul said, he said we live according to the flesh. And as he writes here, when we live according to the flesh, we do evil deeds. Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking. Well, really, I know some really good non-Christian. I mean, they're really good people. They don't do evil deeds. They don't go out and murder anyone. They don't steal in the neighborhood. They don't go around and paint graffiti in the neighborhood. They don't do those kind of things. They're really good people. But we need to understand that the word evil here, it does mean evil. It means bad, but it also kind of carries the idea of things that are worthless. And what Paul is writing here, what he's saying without Jesus Christ, those good deeds that you do, you might think that they're earning favor with God. He says, but really, they're worthless when it comes to that. Because the things even that we think are good, God looks at them and says, they're really not good after all. I mean, here's what the prophet Isaiah wrote about that in Isaiah chapter 64. For we have all, there's the word all again, we have all become like one who is unclean, and all our righteous deeds are like a polluted garment. It says all. Everything we do, we might think it's good, but when we're doing it in our own flesh, when we're doing it by ourselves, when we're doing it apart from Jesus Christ, then God says all those things are really just evil deeds. And because of that, we've been separated from God. We're at war with God because the things that we're doing are in conflict with the things that God wants us to be doing in our lives. As we've seen in Romans, as we've seen throughout this series, once again, there's only two kinds of people in this world. There are those who know Jesus and have the kind of peace that we're reading about here, or there are those who don't have Jesus. They don't know Jesus, and therefore they have no peace in their life. And that's been true for every single person who's ever existed. So that means that all of us, that's the boat we were in at one time. We were at war with God, every single one of us. And because we were at war with God, we needed someone to make peace between us and God. And the second thing we see here is that Jesus is the only one who can do it. He's the only one who can reconcile us to God. He's the only way that I can be reconciled to God. We're going to be talking a lot about this word reconcile this morning. And so it's important that we understand what it means. It's a word that in the original Greek, it just means to change or to exchange something. So in that sense, it's something that a lot of you will be doing here in just a couple of weeks. Because you're going to get some Christmas presents that don't fit. Or that you already have one. Or that you just decide, I really don't need this. And what are you going to do? You're going to go back to the department store, to Walmart or whatever, and you're going to exchange that. That's really what this word means here. Now, in the sense that Paul uses it here, he's saying that what we do is we exchange this hostility with God, this war that we're in, we exchange it for friendship with God. That's what Jesus does for us. Now, that would be great if that's all this verse said, but Paul actually uses an emphatic form of that verb, and what it means to be reconciled totally and completely. So what Jesus did, as it says here, is He came to reconcile, to exchange this hostility, this enmity that we have with God, and to exchange it for this peace, this intimate personal relationship with God that we can have. And there's a few reasons that Paul gives us here why only Jesus can do that, why no one else can do that. The first thing is because it is the nature of Jesus to hold things together. That's what Jesus does. That's why it talks here about this whole idea of the fact that everything that was created in this earth, it was all created by Jesus. The heavens, the earth, everything is brought into existence by Jesus. And when it was first created, it was completely held together. It operated in a perfect manner. But then there was rebellion. There was rebellion in both the earthly realms and in the heavenly realms that took that perfect creation and put it into chaos. I mean, think about it. In the heavenly realms, we know that Satan rebelled against God, and he took a third of the angels with him. And so, therefore, there's no longer perfect peace in the heavenly realms. And here on earth, we know what happened. We know that Adam and Eve, they sinned. And the very moment they sinned is they threw God's perfect creation into chaos. And things were no longer held together in the way that they were at the very beginning of that creation. Paul describes what our world's like in Romans chapter 8. He writes this, "For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of Him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption, and to obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now." Paul says, man, when sin came into the world, that's what happened. The world began to groan with pains, but what it tells us here is that one day Jesus is going to fix all that. He's going to come back again. He's going to make everything perfect again. He's going to reconcile, as it says, all things. He's going to hold all things together in Himself. Because that's His nature. That's who He is. That's what He does. That's what it means here in verse 20 when Paul says that Jesus reconciled all things, both in heaven and on earth, to Himself. And that's the aspect of reconciliation here that's unique to the Scriptures. That's unique to who Jesus is. Not only does He take and exchange this hostility for friendship, but one day He's also going to reestablish God's reign and God's authority in our lives and in the lives of every other person, both in heaven and on earth. But as you read this passage, something interesting happens. If you go through and you look at the verb tenses here, it creates a little bit of confusion, to be real honest. I mean, look at this for a moment. If you look at all the verbs that talk about who Jesus is, they're all in the present tense here. He is right now the image of God. He is right now, present tense, before all things. He is the head of the body right now. He's the head of His body, the church. He is the beginning. So those are all things. That's who Jesus is. He's been that way from the beginning. That's who He is now. That's who He'll be in the future. But it's really interesting when you begin to look at the things that describes what Jesus has done. They're all in the past tense, almost all of them. It says all things were created. That's something that happened in the past. In Him, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. That's something that happened in the past. He reconciled, past tense, all things to Himself. He made peace, past tense. He has now reconciled. In other words, it sounds like a completed thing. So when you read that, you think, okay, what He's saying here is that Jesus has already accomplished this act of reconciliation, this act of making peace, and yet, what do we see when we look around us? It sure doesn't look like that in this world, does it? I don't know about you, but the world to me doesn't look like a real peaceful place. It doesn't look like a place where God reigns and where Jesus reigns. So how can that be? He says it's already done, and yet we don't really see that. I think the key to that is in this whole idea of first fruits. We see it here in this passage. We see it in verse 15, but we see it especially in verse 18 where it says that Jesus is the firstborn from the dead. And in Hebrew, this idea of first fruits means that the first guarantees that everything that comes after it is going to be the same. For instance, when it talks about offerings, it says that when the Hebrews would bring their first fruits of their crops to God, what it did is it sanctified the entire harvest. And when Jesus came to this earth, and He died on the cross and He rose from the dead, it says here that He is the first fruits or the firstborn of those who have risen from the dead. And what that does is it guarantees that all of us get to experience the very same thing someday, at least those of us who are in Jesus, which we're going to talk about in a moment. And so Paul can write about these things like they're already done because Jesus has guaranteed that they're going to happen. So he was so certain of that he writes about them in the past tense. So the first reason that the only way we can be reconciled to God is through Jesus is because it is the nature of Jesus to hold things and to bring things together. But that's not the only reason that Jesus is the only one. The second thing we see here is that we see in this passage that Jesus is 100% God. He's 100% God. We see it in verses 15 and 19. I mean, look at verse 15. It says that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. That word image is really interesting. There's a word in Greek that would mean something like, He kind of looked like God. But that's not the word he uses here. The word image, we get our word icon from it. And what it means that Jesus is the exact copy of God. He's exactly like God. And so what he tells us here is that Jesus is in fact God. He's exactly like Him. And think about it. Isn't that what Jesus told His disciples when He was here on earth? When they come to Him and Philip asks them, remember in John chapter 14, he says, Jesus, just show us the Father. Remember how Jesus replies to him? Here's what He says in verse 9. Have I been with you so long and you still do not know me, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Jesus is saying, I'm the icon. I'm the exact representation of God. I am God, in fact. And then in verse 19, Paul writes this, for in Him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. Isn't that exciting? In other words, Jesus is 100% God. He is God. This is a great passage to take people that want to argue with this idea that Jesus is in fact God in the flesh, that He's God. This is a great passage to take them to because from beginning to end here, it shows us Jesus is God. He created everything. He's the icon of God. All the fullness of God dwells in Him. So He's 100% God. But not only is He 100% God, we find out at the same time, He's also 100% man. I mean, think about it. Look at this passage. He says He came and He died on a cross. He couldn't have died unless He was a man. It says that we've been reconciled by His blood. He wouldn't have bled unless He was a man. Now, there are a lot of people who erroneously say something like this. Well, Jesus, when He came to the earth and He became man, He gave up His divinity or He gave up His deity. That's not true at all. Now, it is true that Jesus did give up some things that went along with Him being God. He gave up for a period of time the right to get the glory of God that He deserved. That's why the Bible says He came down and He humbled Himself. He was born as a little baby in the humblest of circumstances in a manger, in a smelly manger, into this dirty world. But that didn't mean He wasn't God. He was still 100% God at the same time. He didn't empty Himself. He chose for a period of time not to exercise all the power He had as God, but He still had all that power. We see little glimpses of it from time to time as He does miracles here on earth. But what He did is He says, you know, I'm going to give up those rights a little bit. I'm not going to get the glory, but He was still 100% God and 100% man at the same time. And think about it. If you wanted to reconcile God and man who have been separated because of sin, what would be a more perfect way to do that than in a person who is God and who is man at the same time? That's why the only way we can have peace with God is through Jesus Christ, because He's the only person in the history of the world who has been 100% God and 100% man at the same time. So hopefully now you understand why I said earlier, know Jesus, know peace, or if you know Jesus, K-N-O-W, you know peace. That's the only way that we can have the kind of peace that it talks about here. And so that means I have to know Jesus as God, I have to know Him as man, and the way I do that is by putting my faith and my trust in Jesus Christ alone. And say, God, I trust that you sent your Son to this earth to reconcile me to you. To make me no longer have to be your enemy. To make me no longer have to be at war with you. But so I can have this peace. So I can be reconciled. So I can be your friend and have this intimate relationship with you. And if you've never done that, then my prayer for you, my earnest prayer for you this morning is that you wouldn't leave here until you have that right with God. That you've been reconciled to Him through faith in Jesus. I don't want you to leave here today still at war with God. And at the end of the message, I'm going to explain to you a little bit more how you could do that if you've never made that decision in your life and how we can help you to do that. But I know most of us have probably taken the steps to unwrap that gift of peace. We've put our faith and our trust in God. That's why we're here this morning. So for us, what I want to do is to close by talking real briefly about how do I enjoy that gift of peace. I mean, now that I've been reconciled to God, now that I've exchanged this hostility for friendship, how do I enjoy that in my life? Really, two things that we can pick up from this passage. The first one is I have to stay connected to Jesus. Now, hopefully, if you were here last week, that sounds really familiar, doesn't it? I think that was one of the principles, word for word, out of the sermon last week, is that we need to stay connected to Jesus. And we see that here at the end of the passage in verse 23. And if we're not careful, it would be really easy to misunderstand what Paul is writing here. Because you'll notice the little connecting word if. If you continue in the faith, he says, then you get to enjoy this peace. And it would be really easy to say, well, that means if I want to continue to enjoy this peace, then it's dependent on what I do somehow. And that's not what Paul's trying to say here at all. Again, he's not trying to say that somehow you can lose your salvation, you can lose your connection from God. Because remember when we looked at Romans chapter 8, we saw that the little word if, when it's used like this, it's what's known as a first-class condition, and we could really translate it since. What he's really saying, since you'll continue in the faith, if you've been connected to God through Jesus, then therefore you can enjoy this peace. Kenneth Weiss, who's kind of an expert in the Greek language, he translated that little phrase like this. I thought it was really good. Assuming indeed that you are adhering to your faith. What Paul's saying here, he's saying, I'm assuming you're going to do that. And as long as you adhere to your faith, as long as you continue in your faith, and the key word there is that word continue, then you'll enjoy this peace. That word continue is really interesting. It's almost the same exact word that we saw last week. Remember the word abide, and we talked about abide, which means staying connected to Jesus. Well, it's just an emphatic form of that. And what he's saying here is if you just keep on abiding, if you just stay connected to Jesus, then you can enjoy the peace. You know, for this sermon series, we've kind of broken down these different gifts of hope and peace and love and joy. But the fact is that they all come from the same gift giver, don't they? They come from Jesus. And there's a connection there between them. It's not like you get a little joy one day and love the next and hope the next and peace the next. They're all wrapped up together. You can't really separate them out. And they all come from staying connected to Jesus. And as we saw last week, we talked about 3 ways to do that. We stay connected through His Word, we stay connected through prayer, and we stay connected by the one we don't like by being pruned by God. That's how we stay connected to Him. That's how we enjoy peace. But guess what? None of us continue perfectly in our faith, do we? I mean, let's face it, we weren't incapable of doing that. So a second thing we need to do if we want to enjoy the gift of peace is make sure that we keep short accounts with God. Now, I hope I made really clear, my peace with God is not dependent on what I do. It's dependent on Jesus and what He's done for me. But at the same time, every time I sin, it does create some friction with God, doesn't it? It creates a bit of separation from God. And so I have to take care of that. I have to make sure that I do that. And I think that's what Jesus was speaking about right before and right after the passage we looked at last week in John chapter 15. Remember when he was washing the disciples' feet and he comes to Peter? And Peter says, Jesus, don't just wash my feet, wash my hands and head, wash my whole body. And here's what Jesus says to him in John chapter 13. The one who is bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean, and you are clean, but not every one of you. And then in John chapter 15, Jesus said something very similar. He said, every branch that is in me does not bear fruit, he takes away, and every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. Already you are clean. There's the same phrase again. You are clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. Now here's what I'm confident in saying this, that here's what I think Jesus meant. He's saying to Peter, and he says to the disciples, because you've put your faith in me, you're already clean. And you don't need to go and clean and clean and clean again, because that's a one-time thing. You put your faith in me one time, and I've cleansed you through going to the cross, which he's just about to do. But he also tells Peter that you need to wash your feet, because what happens? Even though you've gone out and you've taken a bath, when you go out and you walk along these dusty feet, what would happen? Their feet would get dirty. And that's a picture of us living in this world. When we walk in this world, there's going to be some times that our feet will get dirty, because we're not always going to be 100% obedient to God. And what we have to do is we have to just clean our feet. We don't have to be cleansed. We don't have to be bathed again, but we have to wash off our feet. I think that's what the pruning's all about there too, that sometimes God says in your life you're going to do some things that won't bring glory and honor to me, that won't be good for you, so you have to prune them out of there. And I think the idea there is that when we sin, when we have that separation from God, we need to confess that to Him. And we need to repent, and we need to turn away from it, so that that separation that's there doesn't get too big and we fall away from God. So we need to keep those short accounts with God. This morning we began by looking at some symbols of peace. Well, when Jesus was born into this world over 2,000 years ago, He was more than just a symbol of peace. He was peace in the flesh. He is the Prince of Peace. He is our peace. But like all the gifts of Christmas that we've been looking at over these last 4 weeks, even though that's a gift that's available to all, as we've said this morning, no Jesus, no peace. Because if you want to know peace, you have to know Jesus. Let's pray.